There's a secret Queen Elizabeth carried for decades, one she apparently chose to take with her, until, according to those closest to the throne, she didn't. In the final months of her life, whispers began circulating through the quietest corridors of the palace that the Queen had said something she was never supposed to say out loud. The whispers didn't start at her bedside. They started years earlier, specifically in the period following the death of Princess Diana in 1997, when people inside the palace's inner circle began noticing a change in the Queen's behavior that they couldn't quite categorize. Not grief, not guilt, something more specific than either of those. Multiple accounts from former royal staff, the kind who give interviews only after they've retired, only after NDAs have quietly expired, describe a queen who began, in private, asking questions she had never asked before, questions directed at senior advisors, questions about what had actually been documented, what had been sealed, and crucially, what the palace's own records showed versus what the public had been told. That's a strange thing for a monarch to ask. She had access to everything. The fact that she was asking suggests she wasn't satisfied with what she'd already seen. Here's what makes that detail harder to dismiss. The timing aligns with something verifiable. In 2004, the British government quietly expanded the scope of what could be classified under royal prerogative, the legal mechanism that allows certain documents connected to the crown to remain outside standard freedom of information requests. Researchers who've traced those classifications note that the expansion wasn't announced. It was administrative, bureaucratic, the kind of change that doesn't make headlines precisely because it's designed not to. You have to ask yourself, why does a monarchy that has existed for centuries suddenly need broader document protections in the early 2000s? What changed? The people closest to the Queen in her final years describe a woman who had made a kind of peace with something. Not resolution. Peace. There's a difference. Resolution means the thing is settled. Peace means you've decided to stop fighting it. Those who sat with her in the last month say she returned, more than once, to the question of legacy. Not what history would say about her reign, but what history would eventually uncover about it. That's not the language of someone with nothing to hide. That's the language of someone who understood, precisely, what was still buried, and had finally decided that someone, eventually, should know where to look. And here's where the thread gets harder to follow, not because it disappears, but because of what the palace did next. In the years after those private questions began, the people who had been closest to that inner circle started moving. Not fleeing, moving. Senior advisors who had served through the 1990s quietly transitioned out of their roles in ways that, individually, read as routine retirement. Collectively, the pattern is harder to explain away. Several of those who left gave no public interviews, no memoirs, no speaking engagements. For people who had spent careers adjacent to one of the most documented institutions in the world, the silence was conspicuous. What fills that silence is something more specific than rumor. A small number of former household staff, not senior advisors, but the kind of people who carry trays and overhear things, have described a particular atmosphere in the private quarters during the late 2000s and into the 2010s. The word one of them used, in an interview that surfaced after the Queen's death, was deliberate. Not somber, not reflective, deliberate, as though decisions were being made carefully, one at a time, about what would remain and what would not. That framing matters because it connects directly to something documented. In 2011, it was confirmed that letters exchanged between the Queen and Australian officials during the 1975 constitutional crisis had been sealed, not by the government, but by the palace itself, and were not to be released until at least 2027. When Australian courts later challenged that classification, the palace's legal response was unusually firm for what was, on the surface, a decades-old administrative dispute. The letters were eventually released in 2020, and what they revealed, the Queen's private knowledge of events she had publicly appeared neutral on, reframed the entire episode. If she had that kind of private awareness about Australia in 1975, the question the spine keeps returning to is simple. What else had she privately mapped, privately understood, and privately decided to leave in the hands of whoever came next? The woman who returned to questions of legacy in her final months wasn't doing so abstractly. She knew exactly which rooms in that archive still had locked doors. Those 1975 letters were sealed by the palace, not the government, for over 4 decades. Does that feel like routine protocol to you, or like someone buying time? Drop your answer in the comments below. Because what she knew about Australia is only the beginning of what those locked rooms contain. Those Australian letters, though, they weren't the only thing sealed. They were just the only thing a court eventually forced open. Think about what the release actually confirmed. A sitting monarch who had privately tracked, privately understood, and privately said nothing about a constitutional crisis while presenting a face of neutrality to the world. That's not a one-time posture. That's a practiced one. And practiced postures don't appear fully formed. They're built over years, across multiple situations, until they become reflex. Which brings the spine back to a specific question the earlier sections keep circling without quite landing on. What was she practicing that posture for in the decades before anyone thought to ask? Former royal biographers, the ones who spent years with access to household sources rather than official press lines, have noted something consistent about the Queen's private communication style in the 1980s and 1990s. She compartmentalized, not in the casual way most senior figures do, but architecturally. Different advisors held different pieces of the same picture, and very few people were ever handed the complete frame. That's not unusual for a head of state. What is unusual is the degree to which it appears to have been deliberate rather than structural, a choice, not a byproduct of bureaucracy. One pattern that emerges from those accounts is the way she handled information that arrived from intelligence channels. The British monarch receives regular briefings from security services. That's documented and unremarkable. What's less discussed is what happens to those briefings afterward. They don't enter the standard archival pipeline. They sit in a separate classification category, one that the 2004 expansion of royal prerogative protections quietly reinforced. The Queen wasn't just a passive recipient of sensitive information. She was, in effect, a node in a system specifically designed to ensure that certain things could be known at the top without ever becoming part of the retrievable record below. That's the architecture worth sitting with, not the secrets themselves. Those may never surface cleanly, but the structure built to hold them. Because structures don't get quietly reinforced unless someone, somewhere, decided the existing walls weren't thick enough. And in the final years of her reign, the walls got thicker, not thinner. That detail alone points somewhere the official record still hasn't followed. But here's what makes the architecture worth examining more closely. Because the walls didn't just get thicker in the abstract. They got thicker around something specific. The Queen's private briefings from intelligence channels weren't simply filed and forgotten. They occupied a classification category that sits entirely outside the standard archival pipeline, one that, by design, produces no retrievable trail below the level at which it was received. That's not a flaw in the system. That's the system working exactly as intended. And what the 2004 expansion of royal prerogative protections quietly did was widen the perimeter of that category, not just for future documents, but retroactively. Materials that had previously existed in a gray zone were pulled, administratively, into a space where standard freedom of information requests couldn't reach them. What's worth sitting with is who would have understood the full implications of that change in real time. Not the public, who never heard about it. Not most of Parliament, for whom it registered as routine administrative housekeeping. The people who understood exactly what had shifted were the people who already knew what was sitting in that gray zone and had reason to want it moved. Former researchers who have spent years mapping the boundary between royal prerogative and public record describe it as a living line. It moves, and it tends to move in one direction. What they've found consistently is that the movement accelerates during periods of institutional pressure, not external scandal, but internal recalibration. The kind that happens when someone at the top has decided that the existing structure no longer holds what it needs to hold. The Queen's final years overlap almost precisely with the most significant of those recalibrations. That's not a coincidence, the official record explains. The briefings she received, the compartmentalization she maintained, the deliberate atmosphere her household staff described, those weren't separate threads. They were the same thread, running through the same hands for decades. She wasn't a passive figure inside that system. The evidence, such as it is, points to someone who understood the architecture intimately, because she had spent 60 years quietly reinforcing it. And the question that still doesn't have a clean answer is what exactly she believed needed that much protection. What the evidence has built, piece by piece, isn't a portrait of a monarch who happened to be adjacent to sensitive information. It's a portrait of someone who understood, at a structural level, how power in the British constitutional system actually moves, not through legislation, not through public mandate, but through the quiet, reinforced architecture of what can be known and what can never be retrieved. Return to where this started, the whispers from those closest to the throne, the private questions she began asking after 1997. The woman who, in her final months, kept returning to legacy, not what history would say, but what history would eventually uncover. At the time, that detail read as the reflection of someone tired. Looking back through everything this script has traced, it reads differently. It reads like someone who had spent 60 years managing a system she understood better than anyone alive, and had finally decided that the managing was almost done. Here's the piece that arrived after her death, and that only makes sense if the pattern is real. In 2025, a tranche of Commonwealth correspondence from the late 1980s entered the public record through a routine archival review, the kind that generates no headlines. Researchers who examined it noted something that didn't fit the official framing of the Queen as a ceremonial figurehead. A consistent pattern of private engagement on questions of constitutional authority that, publicly, the palace had always maintained were outside her remit. Not dramatic interventions, quiet, precise, architecturally significant ones. The kind that leave no fingerprints unless you already know where to look. I'm not saying the monarchy is hiding a conspiracy. I'm saying the official story, that she was a ceremonial figurehead who knew nothing the public wasn't told, requires you to ignore everything this script has just walked through. The institutions that have survived longest aren't the ones that operated in the open. They're the ones that understood precisely which parts of their architecture needed to remain invisible. Elizabeth understood that. The evidence suggests she spent a reign reinforcing it. And in the end, the whispers that started in the quietest corridors of the palace weren't wrong. She had said something she was never supposed to say. The question that remains, the one the archive still hasn't answered, is exactly how much of what she knew died with her, and how much she quietly made sure would not. Subscribe if that pattern unsettles you as much as it unsettles me. Comment below on what you think the crown is still protecting.